Hello and welcome. During this tutorial, we're going to take a look at the behind the scenes process, everything that went into creating the exhibit at Summerstar Wildlife Sanctuary. So there were a few key components involved with this, the mounting, trimming, and sealing procedures. And if you haven't already seen the previous video I did on the editing and printing process, you can check that out as well in the link below. Before we jump into the workflow, I'd just like to mention the first step of my whole process was to create this semi-clean room environment to help keep the dust levels down. The table you see me working on here, the white surface is actually a sheet of melamine. You can pick this up from Lowe's or Home Depot for about 50 or 60 bucks a sheet. It's 4 foot by 8 foot in dimensions, which is ideal because the gator board, when you're working with it in bulk, is going to come in 4 foot by 8 foot sheets. So if you don't already have a workspace set up, consider building yourself a nice sturdy bench using a sheet of this melamine. It's also great because it has a nice non-stick surface, so it's just going to make the whole cleanup process a lot easier. The first step of the process here was to process the 4 by 8 foot sheets of the gator board down into sizes appropriate for the different prints I was working with. Again, leaving a few inches of overhang just for a little more material to work with. The sliding rail cutter that I'm using here is a 79-inch KT board cutting ruler. You can find these on eBay for about $260. From my research, I found this to be the only adequate cutting solution for under $1,000. I had to pull a few carpentry tricks out of the bag just in terms of creating some of the process setup that I was working with for the mounting bit when I was feeding the paper through the roller to compress the print onto the gator board. I needed a way to feed a protective sheet on top of the print so that the rollers were not contacting it directly. So my solution to that was just to whip up a little holder that I could basically suspend a 1/2 inch copper bar across, which you'll see in the next scene. But I do like woodwork as well, so this was fun to break out the chisels for a little bit. I spent a few years studying under a master furniture craftsman, and one of the big takeaways from that experience is the quality of square that you're using. I learned the hard way that there's really only one brand of square you want to be using, and that's called Starrett. They're manufactured out in Orange, Massachusetts. They're perfectly true square, so grab one if you care about precision. Alright, time to put the chisels away. I've got my paper feed holding arms all chiseled out, positioning those in place at the end of the table. And then you just grab a 1/2 inch by 5 foot piece of copper pipe, and you've got yourself a paper feed mechanism that works pretty well, and it's inexpensive. Alright, so now we begin the mounting process, starting with the smaller prints to allow some room for error and avoid costly large-scale print mistakes. I'm using a Breathing Color Glamour 2 varnish as a glue in this instance. You can order a gallon of that for about 150 bucks. You just apply it with a roller right onto the gator board. Just coat one side very thoroughly with a uniform distribution of the glue. You kind of get a feel for this after you do a few of them, and then just plop the print right on, trying your best to center it. Again, we left the gator board a bit oversized because we're going to be trimming this down. We want a little extra room to work with. And here you can see my paper feeder coming into play, very useful. Just putting a sheet on top so the print doesn't rub up on that roller, which isn't very clean. And this first one I'm just inspecting to see how it went, but what I would normally do is let that glue dry fully before removing the top paper and then apply some of the varnish we'll get into later. So all in all, I had to actually produce 77 of these prints for the exhibit, ranging in size on the small end from 12 by 18 all the way up to 40 by 60 inches. So it was a lot of work, and this isn't my full-time job. So I was basically in a situation where I began all of this work 1 week prior to the exhibit opening day. So it was a little stressful trying to define a process, having never went through this before. But once I was able to nail down the workflow, then it just became a matter of putting the hours in. I think there was a lot learned here, when things may seem uncertain and there's not a clear path to your outcome, you just need to persevere and push on and keep trying things until you figure out something that works, and that's exactly what I did here. When I first began my research on the best way to mount the print to the gator board and get a uniform pressure application, I was first looking into handheld rubber briar rollers, and then I came across this larger double feed laminating roller that has a 51-inch wide opening, so it's going to be able to handle basically any substrate you'd like to put through there, and it gives that nice even pressure across the entire print. Everything's making contact, so I think this is a critical part of the workflow. After feeding the prints through the double roll laminating press, I found in some instances you'd get the edges curling up a little, so you just need to monitor this situation for the first half hour of drying. Then you can leave it overnight and it should be good. All this wax paper you see me using is called glassine paper, and it's great for not lifting up any of the ink off the print. I made the mistake, if you noticed earlier, I was using a paper roller to protect the surface of the print, and that actually did pull up some of the ink, so I lost a few prints to that. So definitely grab some glassine paper. And then moving on to these larger prints, I think now we're up to the 40 by 60s. You can see the gator board basically spans the width of the table, and I needed to add an extension onto the roller for the glue application. This is a little tricky part, throwing the print on there. You kind of get the hang of it after a few tries. Really the key is just to get it through the roller as quickly as possible as soon as it hits the glue, just to stop buckling and warping from happening. Now that the prints have dried overnight, we're removing the protective glassine paper, and we're going to put on a protective spray by Hahnemühle, and it's fully archival, which is nice. It's just going to protect the color integrity and help preserve the print for a little longer, since they're not going to be in frames behind glass. Ideally, you'd want to do this spraying work in a well-ventilated area, maybe a garage with the doors open. I just didn't have access to something like that at the time, so that's why I'm wearing this pretty intense respirator mask. Alright, so now we're going to switch over to a field recording, and I apologize in advance for the audio discrepancy. Just bear with me here. Okay, now we're going to do some cutting. Basically, the goal here is just to get a nice, even slice. We don't want any fray, and that's why I cut everything in one pass. The gator board, the print, and we already have the protective Hahnemühle spray on here. And when you put a finish over it before you cut it, it actually makes the paper a little more brittle, which is good for preventing fray. So first thing I'm going to do is clamp down these cutting mats so they don't slide when I'm pushing. Alright, we're going to go like this. Get yourself a nice used clamp. The new ones at Home Depot typically are garbage. Ones made 20, 30 years ago, if you can find them on eBay, are a lot better. I'm going to be using some Canson glassine paper to put over the print to protect it, from the cutting rail, leaving an imprint. cut. This was from the west branch of the Penobscot trip. I was warming up by a fire after I almost died, actually, paddling through a 3-hour storm on Lake Chesuncook with some white-tipped waves and just trying to warm up. It's tough to start a fire in the rain, but fortunately I was able to find a birch tree. And for those of you who aren't aware, birch bark has a flammable polymer in its resin, so it'll ignite even when wet. Okay, got a couple tools here. The first thing I'm using is this 79-inch sliding rail, and it takes, razor blades the way you'd put them in a utility knife, and you can take them out, replace them when needed. A rule of thumb, you want to replace these fairly often. Again, you don't want to cheap out on razor blades and sacrifice getting a smooth edge. Also, I'd suggest getting carbide tipped razor blades. Those are going to give you a little more life and better cuts. You can get those at Home Depot or Lowe's. Another important tool, grab yourself a nice Olfa knife. They have removable snap-off blades, so you can just go like this. You have a nice new fresh blade. Alright, so first thing, we're going to cut a piece of this glass scene. Again, this is just to protect the print. Next thing, we're going to change out the blade. Get a nice clean cut here. And then in order to get a consistent angle on this, you want to make sure that whatever device you're using to hold the blade, you're applying the same amount of tension to the holding mechanism each time. So I just turn it until it overcomes the spring force. We're getting the same position every time. Okay. So I'm not using a ruler or anything. I'm just lining this up right to the edge of the print. I'm going in maybe between 1/16 and 1/32 of an inch. So, just taking off as little as possible of the actual print. The other thing, make sure you have a support on the other side here to create a level surface. So just take a scrap piece of the same gator board that you're using, stick it under there. There we go. Reposition the light. You want to make sure there's no shadows on the inside where you're cutting, so you can see what's going on. Okay, once it looks even to the eye, I've got about a 30-second there, a 30-second there. You want to make a couple very light passes. You don't want to try and do this in one go. It's going to take, 6 or 7 cuts. When you get more comfortable and the feel starts to become intuitive, you can get it down to 4 or 5. But the first 2, you just want to break the surface of the paper to create a path for the blade to follow. All trimmed up, and then the last step is going to be to put a little bit of pressure down on these edges, because they do lift up just ever so slightly. It's not as if the glue is coming up, but just the paper itself. So you want to grab a little roller for that. You can pick these up at basically any art supply store. It's just a little rubber briar, about 2 inches wide. The smaller the better for this. This was just the smallest I could find. I really would prefer a 1 inch or even a 1/2 inch. So you're just going to take this and lightly roll down this edge. Not too much, you don't want to curl it over. Alright, now we move into the final stages of the process. We're using these 3/4 inch square wooden runners that are going to be glued to the back with super glue and basically hold the print off the wall a little bit to give it a little more 3D depth effect. As you can see, I'm using these 2 C-clamps to create a little guide just to make the work go quicker. And you should really do this with a drill press. It would take a lot longer if you're using a hand drill and you're not going to get straight holes. Now we're ready to attach the runners to the back of the gator board. We're going to do that before we feed the string through the holes that we just drilled. And you don't have much time before the glue sets, so you want to work quickly with this. Just as a little demonstration of how the hanging system works, we feed it in through one hole. I drilled 2 holes right next to each other, about 1 centimeter apart. So you go in through one, then up through the other. It forms that loop, and then you take one of these little metal crimps here, and you would just crimp it off at the top and do the same thing to the other side. And now you're gonna have a nice sturdy hanging system that's not going anywhere. As I mentioned, you don't have much time before the glue sets, so you want to use a little piece of scrap as a guide. You don't have time to pull out a ruler and actually position this thing. You need to work really quickly and then just use a little mallet to tap it down, get a nice firm contact across the runner, and then repeat the same process for the bottom one. The last thing to do is pack up all the prints, make sure they're well protected for transport, and get them over to the exhibit. I hope this video has been informative and helpful, and you can take some of the workflow concepts that I've developed and apply them to your own situation. This was really all just a big experiment, and I think we can all learn something from each other in the artistic community. So if you have additional insights, please do share them in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I wish you success in your creative pursuits.